Plain Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Port. Later in the show, Lieutenant Governor Brent Sanford joins me, fresh off presiding over a session of the state Senate. Joins me to talk a little bit about the ongoing fight between the executive branch and the legislative branch over revenue forecast. That's all coming up, like I said, a little bit later in the show. But before we get there, I want to go on a little bit of a rant on something I read over the weekend in the New York Times Magazine. Now, believe it or not, I'm a conservative, but I read the New York Times pretty much every day. It's one of the largest and most important news sources in the United States of America, despite their biases. So I read it. I also subscribe to The Atlantic, The New Yorker. I read a lot of these publications because I think it's important. It's important. Even with their biases, sometimes they do good original reporting, and in other ways, it's just good for me as a conservative to be exposed to what the other side is thinking. I think way too many of us get stuck in bubbles. I don't want to be in a bubble, so I read these sources. Anyway, I'm reading along, and there's a column called The Ethicist. And I guess this is some sort of kind of a Dear Abby column where people write in for advice, but it's sort of, it almost made me think of like a Jerry Seinfeld episode, right? Where, the gang on the show all gets, they all get hung up on, some custom or some tradition or whatever, and they sort of illustrate the absurdity of it. Anyway, that's what this is. This column is The Ethicist, where people write in, and I guess they ask questions about, the ethics of everyday life. Anyway, somebody, Dr. Stephen Feld from New York writes in, and this is what he wrote in his letter. I quote, "At a Chinatown restaurant, we go for lunch. There is a lunch menu and a dinner menu. Whenever a Chinese person comes in, he or she is automatically given the lunch menu. When a non-Chinese person comes in, he or she is usually given the dinner menu. The dinner menu is considerably more expensive and does not have the low-cost luncheon choices. We know this, and so we always ask for the lunch menu, which they bring without a problem. However, a majority of other non-Chinese, usually foreign tourists, who come in do not know about the lunch menu and spend more than they need to. I'm always tempted to tell them to ask for the lunch menu. Would that be an ethically sound decision, or should I just butt out?" Now, the person responding to this, he's a gentleman by the name of Kwame Anthony Appiah, Appiah. I apologize if I'm pronouncing his last name wrong. He teaches philosophy at NYU. He's written a couple of books, one called Cosmopolitanism, another called The Honor Code, another called The Lies That Bind, Rethinking Identity. And he's the one responding to this. He's the columnist in charge of this. And this is what he writes in response. "In the scenario you describe, the restaurant's Chinese staff members are partial to their Chinese neighbors. They give them special treatment. They don't have anything against non-Chinese, as they show by happily giving you the lunch menu when you ask for it, so they're motivated by in-group preference, not out-group hostility." So essentially, so far, the columnist is defending this. He's saying, well, even though it kind of seems like this restaurant is sticking it to non-white people, maybe it's not that big of a deal, because when you ask for the lunch menu, it's not like they're telling you no, they're letting you have it. It's just, maybe it's just a little bit of a scam. I don't know. Anyway, he continues, I quote, "Some people think that giving preferential treatment to members of your own ethnic kind is as bad as hostility to outsiders. Others even deny that such a distinction can be drawn. I think that's wrong. In my experience, African Americans, especially in small towns, often smile and nod at black passersby and not white ones. You can have that as a reflex without ever glowering at a white person or refusing to smile back if a person who isn't black smiles at you. Partiality needn't be prejudicial." So basically he's saying, listen, sometimes, you're going to tend to be a little more open, a little bit more friendly with people of your own kind. Right, people maybe of your own ethnic group or people sharing your background. And if he left it there, I think I could understand where this guy's coming from, right? I think, for instance, that veterans, although they're not necessarily united by a shared ethnicity, right? The military is all ethnicities, a lot of different backgrounds. They're united by a shared experience. And that leads to, maybe camaraderie. Maybe that leads to special treatment towards one another that they wouldn't necessarily grant to those of us who aren't veterans, right? Because they had this shared experience. They all have this common thing, this very large thing. It's, especially if they went to combat. It's something. It's sort of amazing when you watch veterans even who fought maybe generations apart from one another, maybe like a World War II veteran and an Iraq War veteran, right? Even though these two people have very little in common in terms of age or generational experiences, they've both seen combat. Therefore, they have that shared experience, and therefore they're going to share a bond that the rest of us don't necessarily have, and maybe that means they nod to each other when they wouldn't nod to somebody else, or they give each other a little bit special treatment. Hey, you know what? I get it. Sometimes you're just more comfortable with people who are more like you. I think that's a very human thing, and maybe even in a situation like what's described in the Chinese restaurant, it's excusable. But here's the problem. Here's where it turns. I'm going to continue from the column. I quote, "Granted, we'd feel very differently about white servers favoring white customers, but that's for two reasons. One is a suspicion that in our society, behavior of that sort would in fact be motivated by negative feelings toward non-whites, that is, by racism. Another is that whites are a majority in this country. Partiality to your own kind for minorities is to some degree a response to the sense that you need to stick together against majority prejudices. White people in America seldom have a reason to respond that way." To me, that's kind of amazing. Essentially what he's saying is, well, it's okay for minority groups, in this instance, Asians, or perhaps in another situation, African Americans, or perhaps Hispanic Americans. It's okay for them to sort of band together against the white majority, but white people better not do it. White people better not have that very human impulse that I just described a moment ago of wanting to gravitate towards one another. Now, I'll admit I've experienced this. I'm a straight white male, and so I guess in the eyes of many, not entitled to have any of these feelings, but I've had that human pull. I've been at conferences with people from all over the country, and you know who I gravitate towards? People from the Midwest, because, we have some shared experiences. I'm not from New York. I'm not from Los Angeles. Heck, I'm not even from Texas. I'm from the upper Midwest, and if there's some people around from South Dakota or Minnesota or Montana or heck, even North Dakota, I'm probably going to gravitate towards them. They're going to sound a little bit more like me. They're going to know maybe we're even related to some people, right? It's all just like one little big town up here on the northern prairie. I kid, but you understand what I'm saying. I've had that impulse, but what he's saying is essentially me having that very, as a white male, having that very human impulse to want to, gravitate towards like. That's wrong, and that's racism if I do it. But if somebody else does it to me, if I'm maybe excluded from a group of New Yorkers, or if there's a group of African Americans and they sort of give me the cold shoulder as a white man, well, that's just to be expected. Now to me, I don't think we should draw distinctions. I don't think that we should treat one another differently based on our skin color. Now, I understand that, again, our human impulse, and I don't even want to call this racism. I think it's just a human impulse. I think it's just something. I think it's just something that's ingrained in us. We're going to be more comfortable with people who are more like us. But if we want to be an enlightened society, I think that's something we should strive to overcome. I mean, there's lots of things that we do that would be easier than just doing what we want to do, right? I mean, most of us don't like to exercise all that much, but we know it's good for us and we should exercise. Lord knows I should be exercising a lot more than I do. We should be eating healthier. It's easier not to eat healthy. It's easy to take the path of least resistance. But sometimes getting out of that rut, sometimes taking the harder path is what's better for us. And in this instance, that may mean in social situations, not giving somebody who doesn't look the same as us or have the same life experiences as us, not giving that person the cold shoulder, not treating that person like a member of a group, but rather treating them as an individual. Now, it's surprising to me. This is in the New York Times Magazine. I mean, this is in one of the largest publications, I saw it on NewYorkTimes.com. It's one of the largest publications in the nation. And this is being put out there like this isn't controversial at all. You essentially have a columnist saying, hey, you know what? It's okay if people of minority groups, people of color, treat whites in a way that may be different, in a way that may even be, depending on the situation, rise to a level that some of us might fairly describe as racist. But if white people do that, well, then that's a different matter. This, I think, is the sort of thing that's a barrier to our ability to find comedy, to find unity in our society, where we endlessly fight and debate about race. I always have to laugh when somebody after an incident says that we need to have a conversation about race, as if we ever talk about anything else. It seems like we don't get anywhere in any discussion about politics without race eventually becoming a part of it. And I understand why. Our country has a fraught history with racism, and the enslavement of people from Africa being just a part of it. I mean, you have the way Asian Americans were treated when they entered into this country. Right? I mean, we have a long history. The way the Irish were treated when they came to this country. The way Italians were treated when they came to this country. I mean, we have a long history of dividing ourselves into factions and then treating each other pretty horrendously. And yes, for the most part, white people have been on the top of that heap. Historically, that is absolutely true. But I think the way to get past that fraught history is not to pretend like it never happened, because it did happen, and it has ramifications that reach in even to today, but rather to start treating each other like individuals. Now, I say this a lot, and I've said this on previous episodes of the podcast, and I've written about it on the blog and in my print columns, but I think it's important. We have got to stop treating each other like we're members of groups. When somebody walks into your restaurant, you don't need to look at that person like a white person or a black person, or an Asian person, or a Hispanic person, or a Jewish person, or whatever their demographic happens to be. You should just treat that like Bob, or Cindy, or Ming Lee, or whatever their name is. Just treat them like that person, like that individual. And if you give them the cold shoulder, then let it be based on who they are as an individual. Maybe they're a jerk. Maybe they never give you a tip. I don't know. Maybe they deserve the cold shoulder. But if they do, don't base it on their race, even if they're white, because that's wrong. You shouldn't make assumptions about people based on their race, and you shouldn't justify mistreatment of them, even if it's minor mistreatment, even if it's something that might merely rise to the level of a discourtesy. You shouldn't base it on their race. It's not fair. If it's not fair to treat black people differently based on their race, or Asian people, or Hispanic people, or what have you, then it's not fair to treat white people that way. That's how we're going to get past this, is by treating each other as individuals. That's what's important. Anyway, if you want to read the whole column for yourself, it's the Ethicist column in the New York Times Magazine. The headline is it okay for a Chinese restaurant to favor Chinese patrons? Go look it up for yourself and read it and consider. Food for thought. That's it for the rant. Lieutenant Governor Brent Sanford up next. This episode of the Plain Talk Podcast is brought to you by Energy of North Dakota. Oil and natural gas from North Dakota strengthens all of America. And through our abundance of talents, innovations, and technologies, energy responsibly produced here translates to worldwide economic stability. With producers and our communities working together, we're securing a sustainable future that generation after generation can build on. It's all happening right now with Energy of North Dakota. Learn more at energyofnorthdakota.com. Lieutenant Governor Brent Sanford joins me now, fresh off presiding over the Senate chamber. Brent, that's something, not many lieutenant governors did that, or at least I shouldn't say that. Jack Dalrymple, when he was lieutenant governor, didn't preside over the Senate very often, but Drew Wrigley, when he was lieutenant governor, I know did it a lot. You're kind of keeping the tradition up. You're there. You like to preside over the Senate chamber.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel bad if I miss a day, but I found out last session that the president pro tem really looks forward to subbing.
Yeah.
So I've had this time I've been a little more benevolent, for, if that's a good word, for Senator Hogue. He's enjoyed it. He's gotten to do it 3 days. But he told me, he said, I tell you what, it's a lot busier than I thought. It's hard to think about what they're saying on their testimony. You're worried about what the next few items are going to be and what the process is going to be. The protocol is kind of complicated, but I enjoy being there. I enjoy being in the Senate every day. It's something where I've always got touch points every day with the senators, and it really lends itself to trying to get along well with executive and legislative branch. I do enjoy it. I like the process.
Yeah, well, I think it's fun. I mean, obviously your position is, I mean, that's the state constitution puts you in charge of the Senate. Although I can tell you when Drew Wrigley, your predecessor, in the office, when he sort of reinstated the tradition, there was grumbling in the legislature about the executive branch, pushing their way back into the legislature. I always think that's so interesting, the little bit, and it's by design. I mean, it's not like an ill spirit type thing. It's by design, but there's always that little bit of friction between the legislative chamber and the executive branch. That's always an interesting dynamic.
Absolutely. There's no way to get around that, and I think it's healthy.
Yeah. Well, speaking of which, there's a little bit of friction over revenue forecasts. Now, your boss came out, and we got two revenue forecasts, one coming from the executive branch, one coming from the legislative branch, and then based on those, the lawmakers kind of adopt what they believe their expectations are going to be. So I guess the process is, to simplify it, is they look at the two forecasts, and then they kind of create assumptions that they're then going to use to budget on. And your boss, Governor Burgum, came out, and he's actually quoted here in a story by my colleague, John Hageman. He says, I quote, lawmakers the forecast adopted by lawmakers, quote, hides at least $200 million in legacy fund earnings that are required by the state constitution to be transferred to the general fund. He goes on and he says this, I quote, this lack of transparency is not only disingenuous, it's a disservice to the people of North Dakota. Now, those are strong words. Brent, describe for me what's going on here.
Well, Rob, we worked ourselves forward from the budget address that the governor presented in December to the January legislative forecast, and that's been well covered to this point, of course, to the point where what we'll talk about here is general fund revenues first. The legislature ended up at $4.173 billion for general fund revenue in their January forecast. Fast forward to March, we've been hearing a lot of conversation about, well, the oil prices have rebounded to normal levels. Now, if you remember, they were down $15 from the current point when that January forecast was being finished up. So there was some concern, but they've rebounded to the levels that they had been in the high 50s, et cetera. And so people have been looking forward to this new forecast in March, which is your basically your mid forecast before as they wrap up the session and get into second and third period, if you will. So it's been, really, really well anticipated and heavily anticipated, I should say. So the executive forecast then comes out because now we have to do one for each, right? This is something new where the legislature does one and the executive branch does one like we always have. And so the March revised executive forecast revenue figures are 4.294. So we've increased $120 million from January to March, and most of that is an increase in sales tax, and that's because of the outlook, and that's all from the commodity groups, from the industry groups, from oil industry, et cetera, and based on oil well completions, and we've got some pretty good levers of how that rolls up. At the same time, the legislature is doing their March forecast. The IHS baseline forecast for March came out at $4.057 billion. So out of the chute, we're $240 million less from the executive branch to the IHS, and almost all of that difference was in sales tax. As a matter of fact, that was $300 million less. If you look at that level of sales tax that IHS used, it doesn't track very well with where we are today. They actually used a number that would be a heavy decline from where we are today, as we've had a over 10% increase in sales tax from fiscal year 18 to fiscal year 19. So year to year, we'd have to drop quite substantially from where we are today in sales tax. So it was a super conservative number. What happened evidently was that there was a conversation about what sales tax that the legislature would adopt, and they tilted heavily towards the executive number. They're instead of $300 million less that was proposed by their consultants, they went $100 million less. So if you look at that number by itself, which I think some of the news stories led with, because you can see that total tax and fees have gone up $25 million from their January legislative forecast. If you take our number out, the legislators actually increased their tax and fee revenues by $25 million. But me as a CPA, I look at this thing and went right to the bottom line and saw, but wait a minute, they're down 175. The governor's looking at the same thing. Wait a minute. What's the general fund revenues? they've gone down 175 from January until now on the legislative forecast, with supposedly better economic conditions, things looking up. Well, what was that reasoning? It comes down to one number, the legacy fund number, which the head of the State Investment Board, Dave Hunter, recommended to use $300 million as a very conservative figure. That number's been rolled forward in all of the forecasts to this point. $300 million of legacy fund earnings. Down in the bottom section, like the transfer section where Bank of North Dakota profits are at, where mill and elevator profits are at, is this line item for legacy fund that went from $300 million inexplicably down to $100 million. And so that's how the reduction was done. So basically, in the end, they've reduced their own forecast to $175 million, and they're now close to $300 million less than the executive forecast. So what does that do? We of course don't have an issue with being fiscally conservative. This isn't about spending. This is about being transparent on the revenue forecast. Yeah. And our point is the legacy fund, by Constitution, is to go to the general fund. And so that number has to go into the general fund. And if they appropriate and spend $100 million of it, then, if this time, put it this way, step back a second, this biennium, we're at I'm the chair of the State Investment Board, so I see these reports every month. We're at $386 million of interest, dividends, and realized gains, which is the formula used to transfer into the general fund. We're at 386 already through January, with 5 more months to go. Those interest and dividends will keep clicking along, and realized gains, you have to sell something to get a realized gain. We're most likely not going to sell low if there's a lot of realized losses. So that 386 will climb, estimated maybe in that 420 million range. And so for this biennium, they had appropriated to receive 200, and we will receive around 420. But when that transfer happens for the final earnings, it's on the last day of the fiscal year, June 30th. This is a little bit of an anomaly in our state law. Might be getting a little bit inside baseball in this conversation, but that happens on the last day of the fiscal year. So that ends up basically being in the ending fund balance carry forward, which anything over 75 million on any fund balance gets swept into the rainy day fund, which is budget stabilization. So I've heard a little bit of conversation about, hey, wait a minute. It's okay if they only appropriate to spend 100 million of legacy earnings in the general fund, because then we're leaving more in the legacy fund to grow and earn and, take on the Norway model, et cetera, and capitalize our earnings and compound that forward. But that's not the case here. By Constitution, the legacy earnings go into the general fund, and also by state law, budget stabilization, it goes into budget stabilization if there's more than 75 million of ending fund balance carry forward, which includes turnbacks by agencies. So this basically is an appropriation in the budget stabilization fund, which, by the way, in the past has been done straight out of SIF. If there's excess oil money in the buckets, then they can decide that, not just a straight appropriation from general fund. So this is a way of looking at less general fund spending, and we know their number is minus 800 or 900 million at this point going in to the last part of the session. So, it's probably a way to try to get more conservative on the legislature themselves. Yeah. But our point is, let's be transparent for the Constitution.
Yes. Well, and this is all really confusing, because we have all these buckets and we have all these formulas and all these funds, and I can understand why an average member of the public who doesn't look at these reports every month and maybe doesn't follow this stuff religiously, and who could blame them? I can understand if their eyes are glazing over a little bit right now. But I think the top level point to take away from this is not about a debate only over any given spending. I don't have a problem if somebody objects to a given spending bill. They think we should spend, they think we shouldn't spend. They're entitled to that, and they can articulate that, and they whether you or I disagree with them, they're certainly entitled to that, and that's the process, and that's all fine. That's all on board. And at the end of the day, your argument, though, is that we are using the revenue forecast to sort of manipulate spending. And that, to me, is what's wrong here. And I remember back during the oil boom days, and I wrote about this on the blog. And by the way, I have a comparison. I have a document there which compares the revenue forecast, if you want to see some of what Brent was just talking about. But back during the oil boom days, consistently, the revenue forecasts were coming in too low. And I talked to numerous lawmakers saying, hey, is anybody worried by the fact that we're missing our revenue point by like $1 billion every biennium? Because that's what's going on here. And, and everybody's slapping themselves on the back saying, oh, look, we got $1 billion budget surplus and everything's great. Aren't we great at governing, et cetera, et cetera. And I was always like, well, listen, the revenue forecast, we're not accurately projecting revenue. I mean, whatever you think spending should be, the revenue forecast should be accurate. And so what I was told by multiple lawmakers back then is that, well, we like that the revenue forecast is inaccurate because otherwise we'll just spend another $1 billion, which A, doesn't instill a lot of confidence in their fiscal responsibility as a body, and B, we should know what money's available to spend. Whether we're going to spend it or not, we should start with an informed debate that's a reflection of the reality of the fiscal picture. Now, some of this, like, our sales tax is going to be high, our sales tax is going to be low, even that is probably up for debate, right? Because this stuff is hard to project
Correct.
out for 2 years. It's a commodity-based economy. If the executive branch and the legislative branch disagree over what the trend line is going to be for sales tax collections over the next, 2 years, fine. I'm fine with that debate. This legacy fund thing, though, where they're just sort of whacking off $2 million and sort of sweeping it under the carpet, pretending like it doesn't exist. That to me looks like a manipulation. We're going to try to manipulate this revenue report as a way to control spending, and I just think that's Governor Burgum used the word disingenuous. I think that's exactly the right word for it.
Correct, and if it would have been $200 million less on the sales tax, like what IHS proposed to them, that's a lot harder to argue with. But in this case, this is interest and dividends mainly coming off a soon-to-be $7 billion legacy fund.
Right.
And so this is something that's a lot more predictable than, as you said, than sales tax when we're commodity-based. So, yes, it's more about the form that we're concerned about. And we also, as you well know, we've had lots of proposals to actually save money, reinvest in other areas that have an ROI, or reinvest in other areas that create better distribution of services that would save some money. And so, we see it's amazing to see how we just gravitate towards 2 and 3 and 4% increases on top of existing processes instead of try to get in and reinvent some processes and be more efficient. So This is just an ongoing conversation from the governor's office, but we also try to hold ourselves true and try to project to the public that we would like to see more transparency in the forecasting and the budgeting on the revenue side too. So this is just another piece of that.
That's exactly it. I mean, it's not about, Governor Burr, your office, and whether I disagree with it or not, agree with it or not. You guys have made policy proposals, but this isn't really about let's spend this way or let's spend that way. Let's do this policy. Let's not do this policy. It's not even really about that. It's about the revenue picture. There are certain realities there that aren't being reflected in the revenue report that the legislature has decided to adopt, right? So they're just ignoring money, and I think that I think what they would probably, if we could get them in a room and give them some sodium, whatever, the truth serum, get them to speak honestly and candidly, they would probably say that it's a tactic to try to instill some fiscal discipline, right? Which I can understand. It can be frustrating, especially given the way the legislature has spent. And by the way, the executive branch has signed in the past. I'm not necessarily talking about this administration, but in the past, the executive branch was signing those bills too. It wasn't vetoing a lot of spending, I'll tell you that. So it is frustrating, and I think this is maybe an attempt to instill some fiscal discipline, but it's not the right way to do it. Manipulating the revenue reports is not the way you instill fiscal discipline. You instill fiscal discipline by voting for disciplined fiscal measures. Right. I mean, that to me is the key issue here. It's not about whether you agree with Governor Burgum's, pitch for the Teddy Roosevelt Library, even though I do. It's not about any of that. It's about let's have an accurate revenue report that reflects reality.
Correct. And this is within the realm of the general fund where, most of our agency conversations happen, where the governor will tell you, with all the agency reviews, we came up with over $100 million of savings. And then they had the opportunity to come back and say, well, with the savings, I would reinvest this way. And so we had a lot of healthy debate within the agency. So we felt these budgets were ready to go, to have a very even level of spending from the prior biennium. And so here we are. But yes, this is a general fund conversation, and it's a transparency of revenue forecasting conversation. So yes, I guess we're in agreement today, Rob.
Yeah. What was that's a good thing. Do you feel like this was politically motivated? Because Governor Burgum, I mean, he proposed some in his, or I guess both you and Governor Burgum in the executive budget proposed some specific spending using legacy fund earnings. The Teddy Roosevelt Library probably being the most high profile, perhaps the most controversial. Is this I mean, because we're basically talking about the same window of revenues, legacy fund earnings, do you think this is a slap at that? Do you think this is a way to sort of undermine the case for the Teddy Roosevelt Library? And the other legacy fund? Okay.
I don't think so. I think what I've actually been hearing is that there's so many conversations about legacy spending, and then there's some conversations about doing away with the legacy earnings coming to the general fund. So it must be more to have less of a number to shoot for. I don't know what else to say. I mean, it's reducing that legacy fund number for all these other proposals to 100 million, saying that's what's available, and then moving the dialogue on to other topics. But there have been a lot of different conversations for legacy spending this time, as we all know, and some of these bills are still active. Yeah. So I have not heard, and I've asked, is this relating to our proposals? And we all know which ones of our proposals are still moving along and which ones are not. So I would say it's a combination of all of the things that have come up for discussion. I would say it's fair to say that the governor did open a conversation on what does a one-time investment look like? What does a legacy investment look like? What conversation should we be having for prioritizing legacy earnings, spending, investing, etc., which has not been done. The first bill that comes out, whichever way it comes, of spending some legacy investment, it will be the first one, and it's been around since 2011. So it's been a long time coming, and the dialogue will continue going forward, obviously.
I feel like we're at a bit, and just last question here, I feel like we're at a bit of a crossroads with the legacy fund, and what worries me is that we have this crowd that keeps saying, let's not really do anything with it, let's just keep letting it grow. I'm worried at some point. I was against the legacy fund to begin with because I'm not necessarily in favor of the government just accumulating billions of dollars out of the private sector for no defined purpose at all. I mean, I feel like there should be a very close relationship between I am taxed X and the government provides Y. I want that relationship to be there. I'm not necessarily, let's just collect a bunch of money in government for some pie in the sky reason down the road. Now, I realize I lost that debate. We have the legacy fund. It's got billions of dollars in it today. That is what it is. What I'm worried now is it's creating a sort of moral hazard where if we don't start getting very, very clear on what the intent is with this thing, we're going to end up doing something stupid with it. We're going to end up squandering it, or it's just going to become this sort of honeypot that attracts, all sorts of proposals every legislative session. We really need a vision for this. We need to figure out what this is for. Do you guys agree?
Yes, that's why the governor laid out the plan that he did, looking for outside match funding, looking for long-term, multi-generational, looking for regional impact, nationwide impact, et cetera, one-time investments. I mean, he was very focused on and very, very, very intentional about what kind of proposals he put forward for legacy spending. And we do have other ones that are still active, like I was alluding to. One of them would take half of legacy earnings and give it back in the forms of really relatively small, in my opinion, income tax reductions for people. It wouldn't wipe out the entire income tax, as we were hearing from some sources, but it would be just a small portion. So is that really worth it to give away half the legacy earnings? And then another one is to actually put all the legacy earnings back in on top and keep reinvesting. And then, and that one's a bipartisan bill that's still active.
Yeah.
So we do have some things like UAS that were proposed that have seen a lot of support statewide,
yeah.
Bipartisan, so there's just a lot of things out there, Rob. So I would say that, yes, back to our original premise here, that's probably the conversation in the legislative halls and leadership, is that there's a lot out there, and this is a way of evidently of reducing some of that conversation.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Lieutenant Governor, thanks for your time.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Rob.
That's it for today's Plain Talk podcast, a request for you, if you're subscribing to this show via iTunes or Stitcher, both of those platforms allow you to rate and review this podcast. So if you would go on there and log in and leave an honest rating and an honest review for the podcast, I'd sure appreciate it. By the way, the podcast should be available on most platforms now. If you search for the Plain Talk Podcast with Rob Port, you should be able to find it. If you have trouble finding it anywhere, email me, rob@sayanythingblog.com. If you ever have any feedback on the show, if you have trouble listening to it, if you have questions for our weekly guest, Senator Kevin Cramer, Congressman Kelly Armstrong, you can email those to rob@sayanythingblog.com. Be my friend on Facebook. Just search for Rob Port. You'll find me. Be my friend. I post everything, all of my columns, the posts from the blog, the episodes of this podcast all get posted there. Same for my Twitter feed. I'm at Rob Port. Both the blog has pages on both Twitter and Facebook as well. Search for Say Anything Blog. You can find it there. If you follow me on social media, you'll keep up with all of the content that I produce, and I would sure enjoy having you as a follower or having you as a friend. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again.